And welcome. Yes, we're going to continue the discussion about what's happening in our world on Three Women. I'm your host, Sherry DeNovo, MPP Parkdale High Park. But we're going to do it with a little bit more of a Canadian slant. We're going to be looking at what's happening federally, what happened federally in 2016, what happened provincially, what's happening in 2016 provincially and municipally. We've got a terrific lineup of amazing women, as always. We've got Vicky Mochama live and in person here in the studio from Metro. She's a national columnist, and she's going to be giving us her take on the big stories of 2016. We're then going to have Niki Ashton. She's MP from Manitoba, possible leadership candidate, and we're going to hear about her take on what's news in Ottawa, what's happening federally. And finally, we're going to have Dr. Aparna Sundar, who is a research coordinator who's just released a landmark study on precarious work in Canada, particularly among racialized women. So that's all ahead on Three Women. And of course, we're live. So you're ahead on Three Women if you'd like to be. We love to get your tweets, and that's just at Sherry DeNovo, so CHERIDINOVO. Tweet me your comments, your questions. We will respond. Or you can phone us, 416-946-7000. Let us know what you think the biggest stories were in 2016. What do you think the biggest stories should be now that we talk about? So, Vicky, welcome to Three Women.
Thank you.
So let's start right in. What do you think the biggest stories were in 2016? And particularly, I mean, obviously, Trump. We have talked about Trump a lot on the show, but for a minute, let's set Trump aside and let's look at Canada. Biggest stories in Canada, federally, provincially, municipally in 2016 to you.
I think the biggest story in Canada that's happening right now is Alberta, which is to say they're dealing with the fallout from the wildfires still, and that's something we don't talk about as much, but also just the economic situation it's ongoing. It's horrendous. They're some of the largest applicants for employment benefits, and I think that's sort of the big economic story. That's where Canada is at, and if you wanted to find out what the economic story is in Canada, you'd look at Alberta.
Interesting, especially in light of Trudeau's announcements about pipelines, which we definitely will talk about. What about provincially?
I'm never that great on provincial politics. I think what's happening provincially is just watching everybody reorganize themselves in Ontario for the upcoming election, seeing where people are starting to pivot towards and who they're starting to send out there with their messages. I think that, to me, is the most interesting.
Yeah, because it's only a year and a half off that election, 2018 in the spring. And what about municipally?
Municipally in Toronto, I think it's road tolls.
Yeah.
Road tolls. And
so what are you hearing? Let's start there. What are you hearing on road tolls? It's a very divisive issue. I mean, it's sort of 416 against the world is how it seems to be playing out. What do you find?
I'm finding exactly that. I think some people are really, especially Torontonians, are big on road tolls, and they think we need to really reframe our relationship with cars and who pays for things, and the rest, not people outside of Toronto are feeling like we already pay for those things. We've already given Toronto as much as it possibly can, and cars are drivers of the economy for Toronto, so they feel like they're being penalized for being drivers of the economy. And so I think those are the two tensions that, we're going to have to deal with in the city, but I think it's going to have a little bit of a provincial fallout as well.
And so looking ahead to 2017, what do you think is going to be the big issues looking ahead?
I know we're avoiding him, but it's gonna be the Donald,
it's the Trump fallout.
Yeah,
And are you seeing that? Like, what are you seeing? What are you experiencing on this side of the border? I was in Chicago recently on a conference, and then I had a longstanding friend from New York, come up and spend some time with her. She's thinking of moving back. She's Canadian originally, partly because of him. But like, what are you seeing? What are you hearing from Canadians? Do you think there's a shift?
I think there's a sense of uncertainty because for so many of us, a relative amount of steadiness with the United States has been part of how Canada operates. And so people are starting to realize that at so many touch points, the United States is heavily involved. And when you have someone like Donald Trump, who's clearly unstable or who will govern in a way that's extremely unstable, people don't know how to proceed thus far. So, we've got a decision on pipelines, but, part of that decision also has to be balanced with what the United States is doing, and we don't know where that's going to go.
Yeah, he's going to build pipelines right through everybody's backyard, I'm sure, if he has his way, Mr. Trump. So there were two breaking stories that are just coming over social media as we speak. One, of course, the Russian ambassador just got shot to death in Turkey. Another, there was it looks like a terrorist attack of some sort. Truck drove into a busy Christmas market in Berlin. 9 declared dead. So, wow. What's the paper doing? What's your reaction to that? Just
On instinct, my reaction is that this is it is just terrible. But it's also part of a pattern that we're consistently seeing now, where there appears to be some sort of fallout that is extending into what we would call the West or Western spaces. And so, there's been increased attacks in Paris and Berlin, places that didn't used to see much of a fallout. And I think that's what we're starting to see in an increased way and in very small and not small, but personal ways. So, like Christmas markets or places where people are meant to be enjoying themselves. That's what I think we're seeing. I think the Turkey one might be slightly separate, but I think it is inspired. It's in that same vein. It's a very personal attack. It's highly visual. And it's something that I think it resonates with people who are on both sides of this issue.
Yeah. Now, you live, work, and breathe the news, and
Yes.
you're a columnist. One of the interesting stories, I think, coming out of 2016 is news itself, is media itself, because very different changing. And looking at the coverage, for example, of the hopefully evacuation of citizens from Aleppo and in Syria. And a friend sent me a note on social media saying, if you look at the RT, if you look at the Russian press, or you look at Arabic press or anything in that part of the world, you're seeing it's all the rebels' fault. They're being shot when they're being tried to evacuate. And then you listen to American news, and it's of course all the Syrians, Russians, Iranians' fault for bombing them indiscriminately. I mean, my gut reaction is probably both of their fault, but we needed to do more, and it was particularly horrifying because we were watching this on social media unfold. What was your take on that and the coverage of that?
I think the coverage of it has been, at least from my angle, from the work that I get to do and the newspapers that I read every day, I think in this sense we definitely dropped the ball. I think we took our eye off the situation, and media, I think, has a responsibility, especially where people are saying, yes, there are atrocities happening here. There are things that are akin to a genocide happening. The media has a responsibility to look and to keep the public's eye on it, even when the public is fatigued of it. And I think part of it was the media stepped back because they felt the public's fatigued of this. There's no action being made here. It's sort of intractable. But what we're seeing now is that it's not intractable, and that there is an inhumanity being perpetuated here that we looked away from for a while.
And huge public empathy, particularly here in Canada, I think, for Syrian refugees and the situation that's produced the Syrian refugees.
But that sympathy, I think, has been short lived. It started about a year ago that we felt this way, but the crisis has been ongoing for the last 5 years. The population of Syrian refugees has been about more or less around 2 million, and now it's 5 million. And so it's been that way for the last 5 years. Canadian empathy for it has only been for about the last year. And I think that's something as Canadians we really need to reflect on. Do we only have empathy in an emergency, or when it's the right thing to do?
Yeah. The other issue vis-a-vis media, of course, is the issue of fake news or social media news versus mainstream news. And one of the things that came out of the Trump election is just this true dichotomy in how we kind of live in social media bubbles surrounded by people of like minds. And I think for a lot of progressives in the United States, they were so shocked at the election of Donald Trump, didn't realize, of course, that they were getting a lot of their news from people just like them in social media. And guess what? The right wing was too. Mm-hmm. And they just happened to be more of them. But I mean, again, both fake news that's just circulated, that's simply unfactual and not true, but also news that is one side or the other, and that you get through social media. But I mean, mainstream media, of course, this has been discussed for a long time now. Every time I turn around, there's another journalist losing their job. So what's your take of where are we going in terms of media?
I don't know. I am concerned that we're sort of at the losing end of a rising tide, because I think how people's psychology responds to news is very different from what is true or honest about a situation. And so sometimes a fact that gets played up is the bigger story than the fuller story that tells you the truth. And I do think, the fact that we're losing journalists rapidly is a real difficulty in that, there isn't the volume of people to fight back against this that there used to be, and there isn't the expertise in some places to do so. And so we're losing journalists, in local spaces where we need, say, environment reporters who know what they're doing to fight back against, information that's not factual. But I also think that there's something false about the idea that we live in social media bubbles. I think a certain sets of people live in social media bubbles. And I especially think if you are white and male, you have the benefit of a social media bubble. But, I don't. You and I were just talking about this before. Like, we have to regularly ban trolls or mute people. Like, I don't get to choose a social media bubble. People who are in constant opposition to how I feel are constantly reaching out to me. It's not so much that I'm choosing information that's good for me, and sometimes people don't allow that. I think some people get to live in social media bubbles, and those are the people who really need to take a look at that.
And what about, Facebook's promise to start dealing with fake news? I mean, and we've all seen it. I mean, I've been privy to it too. In fact, I think at one point I shared one. I got very quickly corrected. But again, there's more and more of that happening too.
Yeah, I think Facebook and Google have a responsibility here. They've usually distanced themselves and said, like, we're just providers, we just provide, a space for whatever. But their algorithm, the fact that they edit it, means that they're publishers. Their algorithm makes choices the way an editor makes choices. And so I think as publishers, it's a new kind of publisher, but I think they have a responsibility to do something about fake news or to figure out a way to serve an editorial purpose which is good for society. And I think, Google's motto is don't be evil. And, well, let's say that they don't always do that. But it's part of their motto and part of their ethos to do good, to deliver good into the world. And their algorithm doesn't always serve the public purpose. And I think Facebook, which is trying to do a little more social outreach, should also try to find a way that their algorithm serves a public purpose.
One of the criticisms of mainstream media during the Trump campaign was that he got too much airtime, and that, say, the Bernie Sanders didn't get very much airtime, and that even though he was saying outrageous things, and that's why he got airtime, didn't matter much, because even if they were critical of him, still got the airtime. This helped his election. What do you think of that?
I think that's true. I think I know I'm starting to see how media works, and it's very I don't know. We're kind of like that fish in Finding Nemo, where it's like a bubble pops up, and we're all like mine, 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 and we run after this bubble. But that's not necessarily what we should be spending our time. It is like a bubble, sometimes meaningless air, and it was a little too late with the Trump election when media started to see like he's just holding these press conferences for airtime and to take up space from us. And so I think we're seeing a sort of equivalent of that in Canada with Kelly Leach. There was a report from the Washington Post where they said media did this. You picked up on her story without checking into it, without asking further questions, and then us as media, the industry that I work for, we blew it out of proportion to what it actually is.
Yeah, I mean, there was a classic case at Queen's Park of that. That I was involved in, because we passed parent equality, which has been a fight that's been going on for 10 years, where, LGBTQ parents eventually, some of them have had to adopt their own children because of the law. Got that law changed, huge victory, took 10 years, took a charter challenge, finally did it. My bill replaced with a government bill, but we did it. Lots of families involved, lots of kids, all there at Queen's Park. And the picture that the Toronto Star carried was of Sam Oosterhoff, the 19-year-old homophobe, and why he wasn't there because he would have voted against it. It's that kind of coverage of sort of, the right, if we can put it that way, that gets progressives freaking out. Because although we get it, like the Star wasn't in any way condoning his stance, it still gave him the airtime, and his picture was there. Well, we've got Niki Ashton. Niki, welcome to Three Women.
Hello, Sherry. Great to be back.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So you're talking in studio now with Vicky Mochama from National Columnist for Metro. And we're just doing a kind of that was the year that was. And I don't know how about you, but I'm feeling pretty good about it being over, almost. What we were talking about, the big stories of 2016, obviously Trump was, but let's get Canadian for a minute. What do you think the big stories were federally in your estimation for 2016?
Right. Well, I would say that first I should note, Sherry, that I'm in the middle of a light snowstorm here in northern Manitoba. So in case I lose you, I will be calling back at sort of par for the course here in the north at this time of year. We were meant to be at final destination, and then things got slowed down. But anyway, but to your question, I mean, the big news I think of 2016 is really sort of the country grappling with the new federal government. I mean, yes, they were elected in October of 2015, but it's really in 2016 where we've gotten to see them in action. And I'd say it's sort of it's been an interesting year to keep track of the promises they've made to Canadians and promises that haven't necessarily been kept, whether it's in terms of climate change and maintaining the same targets as Harper, whether it's in terms of electoral reform, and that remains to be seen, but we've seen some very troubling signs already, whether it's in terms of legalizing marijuana, something that certainly many Canadians voted for, and even the latest task force report doesn't actually offer any real leadership on. And so, I think that people, these commitments are mounting. And this coupled with increasingly challenging times for a lot of Canadians in the economic sense. And I know on our last segment, we had a chance to speak about some of the work that I've done on the rise of precarious work in the millennial generation, something that's very close to a lot of people in Toronto and in a lot of urban areas, in particular across our country. And we're seeing sort of one report after another, whether it's StatsCan or others that are talking about it, that economic prospects are not necessarily getting better, and particularly not for young people. And I think that's something to watch in 2017 very closely.
I should mention, too, of course, for anybody out there, and there may be one or two, but only one or two, that don't know who Niki Ashton is. Niki Ashton, she's the MP Churchill-Keewatinook Aski, key member in the NDP caucus in Parliament, done just about everything. Critic for Aboriginal Affairs, Status of Women, Post-Secondary Education and Youth, and currently the critic for Jobs, Employment and Workforce Development. But you've been doing a coast-to-coast survey, really, and town halls on precarious employment. And I should let you know, Niki, that right after we speak to you, we're going to be speaking to Dr. Parna Sundar. There's a landmark study that's been released here in Ontario about precarious work, particularly among racialized women and communities. So, and of course, it just buttresses what you found out in your travels, that it's up. I think it's over 50% in some areas in Ontario now are precariously employed. And that's a trend that you've highlighted in your travels as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So go ahead.
For sure.
Yeah, so in terms of the Trump effect, I was just talking about this with Vicky, both in media. We were talking about the coverage that he got versus, say, a Bernie Saunders. I was talking about the tendency of our media here in Canada to give, say, somebody like Kelly Leach a lot of airtime for the same reasons, simply because they say outrageous and do outrageous things. And even though sometimes that coverage is critical of them, doesn't matter. The face is out there, person's out there. It helps. I mean, when you look at media over 2016, what do you see in terms of what's happening there?
Yeah, I do. And I think we definitely need to be talking about the Trump effect in Canada, and it was interesting to see sort of in the initial moments of the Trump. I think the Trump win, a very unexpected win for certainly a lot of Canadians. There was a fair number of people that said, well, at least in Canada we're different, and they meant better. But actually, when you scratch the surface, and if you're following the conservative leadership, for example, there's a lot of Trump influence there, whether it's Kelly Leach's comments or things we've heard from Brad Frost and others, or even what we're seeing from Kevin O'Leary, potential candidate or touted as a potential candidate, and that's very concerning. Now, I do think that the Canadian media offers some very sobering analysis on some of this stuff. But then again, Maclean's devoted an entire front cover to Kelly Leach and her commitment to Canadian values, ostensibly to create debate, but I think also, giving a platform to very divisive and discriminatory politics. it's also been very, very good to see the Canadian media take on the misogynistic attitudes and approach taken towards Hillary Clinton, and that's been discussed in the context of women in Canadian politics. People like Premier Rachel Notley. I know a number of us on the Hill were asked to be part of a story on the CBC about the online hate that's directed at women in politics, and I know, Sherry, you and I have both experienced that. And so, it's important to have these conversations and that kind of critical analysis. But I think we're going to need a lot more of it here in Canada as well. Seeing the fact that people like Kelly Leach are doing well with the kinds of ideas that they're putting forward is extremely troubling. And and we need to be clear that we need a inclusive and dynamic vision for Canada that's I think very much based on the notion of justice, and that is something that Bernie Sanders fought for, and I think we need to see a lot more of that in Canada. Otherwise, we risk feeding ground to Trump and the Trump-like approach to politics.
This has been something we've been talking about, Vicky and I, in terms of online trolls and the pushback that seems to have, certainly in Toronto area, increased. I was at an anti-Trump rally, and my staff for the next 2 days spent a lot of time deleting and banning people, none of whom were at the rally. There was no counter rally, but a lot of people here just really overnight, easily 1,000 in horrible weather. But it got clipped on our CP24 here, and the pushback from the online world was really quite horrendous. Vicky, you also had some of that as well.
I'm fairly lucky in this, and that, like a friend of mine says, which is that they just haven't found me yet. But I do get people who found an old article of mine, and almost 100% of the time, if I write the phrase white people in a column, I get a series of terrible emails. I can guarantee at least 7 if I put in the phrase white people. But at the same time, that's why I think we need to recognize that the Trump effect is already here, and it's here in people's attitudes. And that's when I think we tend to fail. We're looking upwards and saying, like, here are the candidates for leader, and here's what they're saying, and that's where we're seeing the Trump effect. I think we're seeing it in people's attitudes. And so there was that poll released last week that, although Muslims compose 3% of the population in Canada, Canadians can think that they're 18%. And so you have an overinflated sense of identity in this country where people feel they're being pushed out. There's a similar poll from about sometime last year saying, 68% of Canadians feel minorities need to do more. Now, these are attitudes that are representative of what you saw leading into Brexit and leading into Donald Trump's election. And so I think there's a sense of that feeling's already here, and it's minorities and women who see it already in this country and others who haven't interacted with it as much yet, and they don't feel that it's here.
And Niki, up where you are in Manitoba, where you part of your riding is First Nations folk, are you seeing any backlash around those issues here, the sort of the Trump effect in terms of Indigenous peoples?
Mm-hmm. I mean, unfortunately, there's always been an element of that, and I've seen it. I was born here, I grew up here, and I've seen discrimination, racism play out ever since I can remember, and directed at Indigenous peoples. But there's no question that Trump has emboldened folks. In fact, we had our provincial election in April, and there was a house in my hometown that had a sign for Trump during a Manitoba provincial election. And, suffice to say, we didn't assume that was a 1 or a 2, an NDP supporter. So we didn't I certainly didn't get a chance to engage with that particular constituent, but no question they were emboldened. And I'm very concerned about, further emboldening with respect to, the dynamics in our region. In fact, I spoke to a high school the day after the American election. It was a pre-scheduled visit, and the teacher told me right away as I was going into the classroom, she said, I'll tell you right now, they want to talk to you about the American election. And she told me that one of her students, who I'm not sure if it was Indigenous, but most of her class is Indigenous, came to school talking about having nightmares with Trump having won. And so, no question, people in our neck of the woods know that the politics of Trump and those that espouse it only spells trouble, and certainly is a backward move from years of trying to build bridges and certainly commit to the spirit of reconciliation. And so we are very concerned about it in a local sense, but also obviously increasingly now a national sense as well.
And there was an article that Tom Walcom wrote in the Toronto Star today, basically talking about Trudeau and neoliberalism, that he's kind of put a pretty face on some of Harper's policies, but that's starting to wear thin a little bit as his numbers are taking it's still ridiculously high, but taking a bit of a beating in terms of his policies. So that's the other face we deal with. Well, listen, thank you so much, Niki, for being on the show. What's happening? I'm going to ask the question, and you don't need to answer it, but what's happening with the NDP leadership now?
I think 2017, I guarantee, will be an insightful year on that front. I think we're all waiting to see how things go. It's no secret I've been asked to think about it seriously, and I have been, and we'll be taking time over the holidays to do that as well. And I've been keen to hear people's feedback from across the country. We did have some big projects on the go over the last few months that we were focusing on, whether it was our tour on precarious work, and we just did our launch on our call to action this past week, which was very well received, and put forward some bold ideas that young people across the country are calling for to deal with the rise in precarious, not just work, but life that they face. We've also been fighting some key issues in our riding, including calling on the federal government to nationalize the Port of Churchill, which is a real strategic asset for us. And so that was on the go even even until the last days of Parliament. And so we were able to get some things out of the door that we needed to, and we'll be seeing about we'll be looking into next steps to 2017, and who knows, we might be looking at another big project. But I'm excited. More importantly, I'm excited about the prospects of our party. There's no question we need to get on track. And already the cracks are appearing in the Trudeau government, and we can't cede the ground to the right. We need to make sure that Canadians have a progressive alternative to represent them and fight for the issues that matter. So I'm sure we'll be in touch, Sherry.
Absolutely. Well, listen, have a merry and a happy, and we're going to take a little bit of a break here on Three Women. By the way, just a note to all, if you want to phone in, 416-946-7000. Vicky's here with us for the hour. Next up, Dr. Aparna Sundar talking about her groundbreaking study. But right now, Joni Mitchell.
The dark cloud above you, dialing the number who's bound to love you. Oh, honey, you turn me on. I'm a radio, I'm a country station. I'm a little bit corny, I'm a wildflower waiting for you. Broadcasting tower waving for you, and I'm sending out this signal here. Hope you can pick it up loud and clear. I know you don't like weak women, you get bored so quick. And you don't like strong women, cause they're hip to your tricks. It's been dirty for dirty down the line, but you come when you whistle and you're loving and kind. If you've got too many doubts, if there's no good reception for me, then tune me out. Cause honey, who needs the static? It hurts the head and you wind up cracking, and the day goes dismal from breakfast party to the sign of prayer. What a sorry face you get to wear. I'm gonna tell you again now, if you're still listening there. If you're driving into town with the dark cloud above you, at the station, the lights are open.
Right here, right now, every day. CIUT 89.5, Toronto. Sound of your city.
And welcome back. You are listening to Three Women. I am your host, Sherry DeNovo, MPP, Parkdale High Park, here in the studio with Vicky Mochama from Metro, a national columnist. We've been talking about the year that was, 2016. We just talked to Niki, Ashton, MP up in Manitoba Way, federal, talking about federally what's going on. And one of the issues that she's been busy on is precarious work and the increase in it, particularly among millennials. This is a sea change, and one that the Minister of Finance has said, yeah, just get used to it, because this is what you're looking at for the rest of your life. Doesn't make me feel too easy. We have somebody weighing in on that from an academic point of view, Dr. Aparna Sundar. Dr. Sundar, welcome to Three Women.
Hi, and thanks for having me.
So I gather you just released what really is a pretty landmark study. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And first of all, who you are and where you are?
Well, where I am is right now, I'm the research coordinator of this study, which is called Working So Hard and Still So Poor, a Public Health Crisis in the Making. And it talks about the health impacts of precarious work on racialized refugee and immigrant women. This is a report that was actually a study that was done out of Ryerson University and led by Professor Winnie Ng, who was at that time and just till recently the Sam Gindin Chair in Social Justice and Democracy at Ryerson. So a number of us carried out this study. It was released in October this year, and it really it's based on in-depth interviews with 40 women who are refugees or immigrants to Canada and racialized, and it talks about the experience of precarious work.
I remember when this was launched at Queen's Park and made quite a bit of news at that point. What did you find?
Well, the most striking thing that we found was the fact that so many of these women are doing what we would call precarious work, which is low-wage work, not enough hours of work in a week, very unpredictable schedules. And so as a consequence, living in poverty and having to juggle 2 or 3 jobs during the week, as well as manage all their family responsibilities. And the consequence we found of that was that there was extreme both physical and mental health consequences of that for these women, and often for their families, and also in many cases for the healthcare system, because many of them worked in health services, in personal care, and then also in food care and food services, including fast food. So this connection between precarious work and its health impacts is what was really striking for us. And we saw it as a sort of a health crisis, a public health crisis in the making, a kind of epidemic of precarious work.
Now, I can just hear that voice. We were talking before, Vicky is in the studio here, about the effects of the Trump election, a little bit seeping north. And, who knows? I mean, not that necessarily is an increase of racism, et cetera, but people are feeling emboldened to be more open about the racism they carry. Yeah. But I can just hear that voice now in response to your study saying, but this has always been the way. Immigrant women, racialized women everybody's had to start off working their way up. But the point is, their children do better. They come to the country, they get not a great job, not in line with their academic credentials, but they work really hard. If they don't get ahead, their children do go to university and go on. This is the North American way. What would you say to that voice?
Well, 2 things. First of all, there are women in this study who've been here 25 years and who actually came here with very good credentials. So these were women with postgraduate, degrees, post-secondary degrees, who in 25 years have not been able to find a stable job in their line of work or in what they were trained for, but not even in something equivalent, and have even gone for retraining and still not been able to find it. So that's a long time in which to not have been able to establish yourself. But secondly, we had fewer second-generation participants in our study, but the young people that we did talk to, the young women we talked to, had stories again of not being able to really make a good life for themselves, despite having all of them had university education. They're still struggling with the effects of having had parents doing this kind of precarious work. They themselves are having to look after family, they're having to pay back loans, and they don't have the kind of social networks that people have when their families have been already sort of settled here, and you have some kind of social capital built up. You have cultural capital. You have people who give you a leg up or give you introductions to into various kinds of jobs. Many of them lack this, so they actually just don't have those kind of support systems that will allow them to get ahead, and they find they're in a way reproducing that cycle of precarity and instability in their own lives.
It's not the one generation thing it once was. It's now two generations. Vicky, did you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, well, I'm just curious. You mentioned cost to the health system. Are there interventions that you'd like to see out of your research that the health system could do to step in? Are there things that are working elsewhere that Canada could bring in, or Ontario at least could work on?
I can't speak to things happening elsewhere because this was a very focused study and on what's been happening here. But one of the things, there's many reasons why we said this is a problem for the public health system. One is the use of temp agency workers in long-term care facilities and other kinds of care, as personal support workers, for instance, for people who need long-term care. So much use of temporary workers, and the workers themselves said, we don't get to know our client's name, and then the next day we might be sent to another home, or we might be shunted to a different facility. So there's complete lack of relationship which they would like to have with the people they're taking care of, and that has consequences for the patients themselves. The other thing that they talked about, and there is another study that makes a contrast with facilities in Sweden and Scandinavia more generally, where in Canada they found that they're much more short-staffed in these long-term care facilities, much more short-staffed, and so as a result, there's just a lot more juggling and a lot more use of temporary workers, and the workers themselves are overworked and subject to much more abuse. And so, clearly there's just a problem that has to do with how these facilities are being run and probably financed. I mean, a lot of it just has to do with investment in the sector. But the use of these temp agencies is something that really should be looked into.
Yeah, and that's become kind of pandemic in healthcare these days. I know CUPE was asking, they had a campaign to ask for a certain number of hours. I think it was 3.5 hours per day per client. Mm-hmm. And I know that I haven't seen the government stats about this, but not too long ago it was considerably less than that. When you think about some folk who are in long-term care,
right,
with Alzheimer's or some serious physical disabilities, that's not a lot. That's like a bath and some meals.
Yeah.
I mean, that's if they're the long-term care workers we spoke to, just in the health, not looking at the precarity of their work, but we're saying, somebody could be having a crisis down the hall, and I'm looking after somebody having a crisis, and I can't be in two places at once. So
right. Yeah.
this is quite terrifying. Yeah. So what are you, at the end of the study, what are you calling on the government? I guess in this case mainly provincial. What are you calling on them to do with this information?
Well, there's a number of recommendations at different levels. And one has to do with just addressing the precarious work conditions. So, first of all, the $15 minimum wage that there's a strong campaign building for, and our study definitely, reinforces that demand. but also more regular hours of work. So even if you get a higher minimum wage and you don't get many hours of work a week, it doesn't add up to very much. So that's something that we're asking that the government looks into, some kind of minimum hours of work, and also questions of scheduling, because a lot of the women participants that we have spoke about this complete lack of being able to predict how many hours they're going to get every week, and being on call all the time and not being able to take time with family because they might suddenly be summoned to something. The other things with 10 days personal emergency leave that should be made available to all workers, regardless of the size of the firm that they're working for. Paid sick days, which was the other thing that all of them, laughed when we asked them if they had paid sick days, because
Which is shocking in the healthcare industry.
Yeah,
You don't want people
yeah.
going to the hospitals sick.
And they're sick themselves. They're, not able to take time off to recover. They're spreading the infection, or in many cases, they're having, and also pharma care of some sort, because in many cases they're making these choices about how to treat themselves, right? They're not able to actually afford to fill a prescription. Some of those. The other is childcare, which is, again, I guess it goes beyond this group of women, but it is a real problem for them, because many of them reported how it compounded their isolation, the fact that they couldn't leave their children in childcare and had to stay home for that, often when they had just come to the country, and so it prevented them from establishing the kinds of networks, as well as getting the kind of training or even English language facility that they needed. So childcare was a big demand for them. And then we have a number of other kinds of recommendations about the healthcare system itself. Decent hours of work, which I mentioned, the temp agency system, and then really addressing this question of the systemic regeneration, or the systemic intergenerational reproduction of precarity that we found, right? Some way in which you take seriously the fact that these young people actually face barriers when trying to enter different professions, both because they lack social networks and because they also sometimes meet forms of, systemic discrimination in hiring.
Are the women you spoke to, and we were saying all of this, of course, in light of the Trump election in the States, and let's say the word, are they more afraid because of some of the racism and Islamophobia, for example, and anti-immigrant sentiments that have come out? Was that noted at all? I know your study was before that election, but do you notice that among folk that you're talking to?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to post-election again, because the study was conducted before. But the experience of racism in the workplace, almost all of them spoke to that. Especially often women in personal care and so on spoke to being abused and just shouted at and so on in racist terms. And many of them also just spoke about their hesitance in responding because they also felt vulnerable in other ways. If they're new refugees, they didn't have their papers in terms of permanent residency. They were worried about bringing over other family members. So many of them just felt they couldn't actually assert themselves or respond, and they had to take this kind of verbal abuse. And sometimes even in long-term care, sometimes many of them even have been attacked physically or kind of shoved, or there was various kinds of stories of that as well, but certainly verbal abuse, and also feeling like they were often not given the right wages, or being cheated in some way because the employer or the temp agency often thought they could get away with it.
Yeah. Vicky, how are we not dealing with racism? It's kind of shocking. That is, I mean, I always say, as a white woman, I've never been carded, and I've lived in the city a long, long time. And, clearly that's race privilege, because every person I know of color has been carded by cops at least once. But, why is this such an intractable, what is it? Why can't we get away from this?
I mean, I think it's for me. I always default back to it's not necessarily about racism, but in Canada, it's about whiteness and that feeling of entitlement to a space. I've had extremely reasonable, educated people tell me this is a white country. And so that sort of attitude permeates across the whole system, which is to say, a woman who is, hyper educated and trying to get a job in her field, when she comes to this country and she doesn't look like how white Canadians expect her to look, they don't really allow people in that space, and they don't expect or even allow people to demand what they're worth. And so, even if everything works out and someone gets to work in the field for which they're trained to work in and that they're educated to do, they're often underpaid for that. And that's even, and I'm sure you found this in your research, where it's like there's all these multiplying factors where people aren't getting paid what they're worth. And there's all these factors, language, race, ability, that subtract wealth from them, and then that's actually subtracting wealth from their families.
That's right.
And so unless we address, the problem of, white entitlement in this country, it'll be hard to address racism. It really will be. And so you see it in, Indigenous communities, where they are the beneficiary, they're on the direct, not beneficiaries, but they're the people most punished in this country because of white entitlement. White entitlement took away their land and took away their space, and that sort of attitude has filtered down across our whole system, and it's still there, and we still don't really deal with it. We expect other people to be less racist, but not white people to take up less space.
Well, I hope that, my hope is that that's shifting a little bit in our school system and education, but it takes a long time. And we forget that this is the country that invented apartheid. We shipped it to South Africa. They copied our system here. Well, thank you, Dr. Sunder. What's next for you? What are you going on to now?
Well, not anything in this area right away, but we're hoping. Winnie and some of us are actually doing another study that looks at the impact on racialized immigrant men of this kind of work. So this was particularly focused on women. The reason why we're doing these two separate studies is because, of course, the impacts are quite different on men and women. They work in different sectors, for one thing, and the kinds of, for instance, if you think of taxi drivers as a group of a large group of racialized immigrant men, the kinds of impacts that they experience in their work. So there is a new study that is just being started on that, and that's what we'll be hopefully reporting maybe in a year from now.
Thank you so much for the work you've done. Say hi to Winnie and have a merry, merry, happy.
Yes,
and
you too, Sherry.
and hopefully we'll keep our eyes peeled for the next study that comes out. I'm sure it'll be fascinating, and I hope the government's listening. Okay,
Yes,
take care, Dr.
Thanks so much,
Sundar.
Sherry.
Again, research coordinator coming out of Rarcy University, groundbreaking study on a group of women precariously employed and indicative of a much larger group, of course, who are there for a variety of, as Vicky said, factors, and just getting stuck there.
Yeah. Another thing about that is we don't have good data in this country. We failed to collect race data for quite a long time, or did it in such a patchwork way that it's hard to track, which communities are benefiting or not, who's making money in what industries. We simply don't know. We're making some best guesses. We have a 10-year gap in good data because of the fallout of pulling back the census. So we have a problem around collecting data, period. And when it comes to collecting race-based data, we don't just have a problem. We have a massive issue that will be hard to undo because we simply don't have a good enough picture. I look at this every single day, and almost every single time I have to qualify my data, which is to say, well, the best data we have is for 2006, and that data is about 20 years old, so it's also inadequate.
Yeah, or we just get anecdotal about stuff, which is, of course, the worst.
Well, anecdotal data, I'm a feminist, so I believe lived experience is the truth, but anecdotal data is hard to make policy around. It's hard to shift and say, well, here's what we need to do. It's easier for, I'm sure politicians to say, like, here's hard data, we can point our resources at that. It's harder for someone to say, an older lady called me a name. Politicians have less access to something to do about that.
Yeah, we fought for, and the government has moved on starting up the race-based secretariat, the directorate that's presumably will do some of that work. But you never know what comes out of those bodies, and live in hope. But that used to be in the province. Harris got rid of it. Finally, we fought to bring it back. So we hope that brings up some information as well. But, my sense is just even in my own writing is some schools have a majority of kids of color, and some schools have a majority of white kids, and that doesn't make any sense because they're all mixed up. So how come? Why is that happening? And guess who has the better books and the better scholarships and the better everything else? It's very clearly happening at our school level, and sadly so. And I know, and again, it seems so I don't think it's anybody's at TDSB. I think they're doing what they can, but how to move forward.
I mean, I think the reporter Nicole Hannah-Jones from the New York Times, she does great reporting around schools and school segregation. And we think, in the United States, they really have school segregation. That's a fallout from Jim Crow and slavery, and that's such a unique system. Absolutely not. In Canada, we have it too. It is replicated exactly in communities like yours and in communities like mine, where there's suddenly a shift in the racial makeup of kids. Part of that is activism on behalf of parents who, say things like, I just want better school quality, or I want to make sure that my kid has these resources at school, therefore we go to a different school. That is, that is racism. That is how racism gets abstracted and diffracted by people who you would not think, who would never claim to be racist, who would never think that, who'd be the kind of person to say they don't have a racist bone in their body. But that's the ways in which I always say, school is racist, but that's because it is racist at almost every single step.
Yeah, there's no question, and in particular where Indigenous peoples are concerned. I mean, you can show it. It's graphable. I mean, they're simply paid. Their schools are paid less per student to educate them than for the rest of Canadian kids, and that is definitely racism. And for some bizarre reason, again, a promise broken on behalf of the new federal government said that they would write that. Put a little bit more money into the system, but it's still woefully inadequate in terms of what any kid in a big city would get in terms of education. So again, ongoing and systemic right across the country. So looking ahead for you, for yourself, my dear. So as national columnist, what sorts of issues are you going to be looking at coming up?
Speaking of race, I'm really interested to see where this conversation about reconciliation goes. I know it's a long-term project, but I think Indigenous people have been waiting and being, taking some very strong activist stances, and I think it's time to see some real and genuine action. And so, last Thursday, the Prime Minister fulfilled one of the calls to action around reconciliation, which was to give $10 million to the National Council on Reconciliation out of the University of Manitoba. But that's only the second promise thus far. That's only the second call to action fulfilled. There are 94.
Yeah.
And most of them are
we
coming
still
from
haven't signed on to the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights. We've, the federal government said that's not practical. I don't get why. It was a promise that they ran on. The other thing that I think just is stark is the okay on the pipelines without consulting First Nations. Because again, you're talking about their land, their unceded territory. That's going to be a huge fight. And we just look at what's happening in North Dakota to see where that might end up. Mm-hmm. And I think there really is that kind of fervor and that kind of shock that again that they move forward without the consultation that was needed on that. So that's in the future for sure. You said you were a feminist, Vicky. For women, what do we have to look forward to other than the fact that we've got somebody in the White House right now who is proud of assaulting women? What?
Yeah.
Anyway.
I think, for women, I think for the work I do, and I try to qualify the things I feel or the things that I experience, it is for me about data. We still don't have gender-based data. The government has, our prime minister says I'm a feminist, and when asked for his government to collect gender-based data or to see how the effects of gender on data on policy, the government's nowhere on it. And I really think to me that's a feminist point. I think he can read all the feminist books he wants. I mean, he can go out and get the new Roxane Gay novel when it comes out. But, I want to see that man put some actual feminist policy behind his feminism claims.
Like a national childcare policy, because, ain't no equality without childcare. That was one of, I always say, I'm an old woman, and I said, and back when I was a teenager, the feminist calls were control of our own bodies, still fighting for that in many places. Equal pay for equal work, don't have it, make about 73 cents of the dollar that men make. And finally, childcare, because let's face it, that mainly falls to women. And unless we've got affordable, we always call for free universal childcare. Well, we'd be happy with Quebec. Like $7 a day would be amazing because we've got the most expensive in Ontario. But I mean, we need national action on that. That's, again, you're not going to have equality. We heard about it from the study with Dr. Sundar saying, childcare was one of the issues. Like, how can you work if you don't have adequate care for your children?
Yeah, and I also think, for me as a feminist, I always think like we need to divorce some of the policies we have, especially around taxes, from the notion of family, because I think that really penalizes a lot of women who are towards the lower end, where it's like marriage isn't an option or wasn't part of their lives or no longer is anymore, but they still need the benefits of being